friends are synths.
So for today's video, I'm going to be taking a wee look at Mavis, and by that I'm not suggesting that I'm going to go and stalk some old English woman or anything like that, because Mavis is actually the name of a brand new synthesizer from the legends over at Moog, also known to those of us in the UK who can't say their name properly, Moog. Now Mavis is a monophonic, analogue, semi-modular synthesizer, which, as you can probably tell from this extensive patch bay and the size comparison with my hand, manages to pack in quite a lot of functionality into quite a small space. Now this synthesizer in particular was specifically designed to be a kind of ideal initial foray into the world of synthesis from one of the industry's most well-known and well-respected synth manufacturers. Now right at the start of this video, you will have seen there's a wee thing that says this video includes a paid promotion, and that is because Moog sent me this for free. Now I have to underline and make it clear that no cash exchanged hands for this video. They didn't pay me or anything like that, like I'm sure some of the more famous YouTube superstars get paid. The interaction basically went along the lines of, hey, we've got a new synthesizer, would you like to try it out and maybe see if you could use it on your channel or something like that? And I went, aye, I think I would like to do that. And so that was basically the sponsorship situation of this video. Now, as you've probably seen, there are tons of videos on Mavis already. Every man and their dog seemed to get one for launch day. And so if you're interested in the technical side of things or want a more in-depth walkthrough of Mavis and all of its features, then you might be better going and watching Loop Pop, because they do that kind of thing very well. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk about it from a very subjective, personal standpoint in terms of somebody who will use it within my studio to make music, and maybe, you know, give you some thoughts on who might want to buy this and what use it might be in a kind of bigger setup. So that's my plan. Before I go any further though, I want to apologise in advance if my voice is a wee bit scraggly or anything like that. Not only did I bite through my cheek with my wisdom tooth right before I started recording, but also earlier on the fire brigade decided they had to force entry into our property through two sets of doors because there was a fire alarm going off when we weren't here. So it's not been the best day in the world, and if you can send me all of the positive comments into the box below, that would be very much appreciated. Now Mavis comes as a kit that you have to put together yourself, and as I am saying that, as the words are leaving my mouth, I can hear the screams of terror from people who, like me, are not exactly excited about the prospect of having to put together a synthesizer. However, what I would say is that once I actually got the synth into my hands and saw how everything was packaged, the kind of care and attention that had gone into not just the packaging but also the instructions and guide and all that kind of thing, then I was much more, well, I was relieved, because really it was a very straightforward process to put the synthesizer together. You don't have to solder anything, you don't have to do anything particularly complicated. All you really have to do is put the rubber feet on, kind of put the top panel into place, screw in the jack nuts for the patch bay, and that's kind of it really. To be honest, the hardest thing, or at least the thing that I found hardest, was putting the sticker on the back and lining it up properly. Although to be honest, this was actually pretty cool, because if you can see there, you get to actually write your name on with who assembled it and the date and all that, which is quite a nice touch, because there's this whole thing in the, you know, documentation and stuff about, you know, building a synth, it helps connect you a bit more to the instrument than if you just buy it, which, you know, may or may not be the case. Now, one warning that I would give you for the build process is that you get this wee tool here which helps you tighten the jack nuts on the patch bay, and this is actually really useful, and I'm definitely going to be keeping this for other projects. However, you have to be careful when you're using it that you don't over tighten the jack nuts or press the plastic down against the faceplate, because this can easily scratch Mavis or the kind of chassis, and I've actually seen that on some other people's YouTube videos where they've clearly not realised this and they've just pressed it right down and turned it. So do exercise a wee bit of care if you don't want to scratch your faceplate. That's kind of something worth watching out for. Now, you can either use your Mavis as a standalone desktop unit, or you can further integrate it into an existing modular system by screwing it into your rack and also just using standard Eurorack bus power. However, if you do want to use it as a standalone synthesizer and you're not into the whole money pit that is Eurorack just yet, then within the box you get this nice plastic enclosure as well as a 12-volt DC power supply, and in addition you get this added kind of plastic top part which can act as a wee bit of extra protection if you want to take it anywhere, but also generally just acts as a nice dust cover. As one might hope and expect from a semi-modular synth, but which isn't always the case, you do also get included a nice wee collection of patch cables here in a fetching green colour. Now, the one thing that I would say is that if you're installing this into your rack, then I found that my box didn't include a Eurorack ribbon power connector, which I thought was a bit strange because that seems like a fairly standard thing that should be included. It might just have been my box, but I didn't see it in the user guide as something that should have been included. So if you are wanting to use this within your modular system, you probably will have a spare ribbon power cable kicking about, but just be aware of that. It seems to be something that you need to source for yourself. Now, one thing that I think is really cool about Mavis is the addition of this squishy keyboard down here. This is a kind of wee rubbery keyboard which spans 1 octave, and it kind of reminds me of using something like the ZX Spectrum. It's got a really good feel to it, although I know that it won't be to everybody's taste. But I do have to say that within a kind of semi-modular setup, or even just a small synthesizer like this, having an onboard way to trigger certain notes, even just to test out sounds or play with this on your lap, on, you know, when you're mucking about watching the TV or something, that is awesome, because a lot of the time you have to use an external synthesizer, sequencer or keyboard or something like that to get any sound. And so I really like this addition, and it's a really smart wee thing to have in a module. Now, one thing that I do have to flag up is that Mavis does not have any MIDI input jacks, not even over the dreaded mini jack or USB connections. And whilst this might seem quite strange to some people, it's actually not that unusual in the modular world. And one can only surmise that if they had included something like a MIDI to CV conversion module in there, then it would have exponentially increased the cost and probably made Mavis much less attractive for what it actually is. If you do have a studio that is heavily reliant on MIDI, then this is something to be aware of. You can of course get MIDI to CV conversion boxes and all that kind of thing, but you can also get a whole ton of sequencers and controllers available fairly cheaply that will let you control this thing if you want to use something other than the internal keyboard or integrate it within your modular system. For example, the Korg SQ1, the Arturia Beatstep and Keystep Pros all have that kind of capability, but it's something to be aware of. A worthy mention, of course, has to go to the wave folder on Mavis, because this is the first time that a wave folder has been included on a Moog synthesizer. And I'm not going to pretend to know all the ins and outs of this, but essentially, historically, Moog were known for their subtractive synthesis, which is where you have something and you take away from that something to get the sound, whereas a wave folder is more of a kind of relic or a feature of additive synthesis where you join things together in order to get a different sound. So it is quite unique and novel to have a wave folder on a Moog instrument, and it's pretty cool to see it on there, and I'm interested to experiment with that a bit more along with all of the classic kind of Moogy sounds. Historically, I have not been a big fan of semi-modular synthesizers, and part of that has been because I don't really think they're necessarily the best way for people to learn signal flow when part of the connections are hidden away and preordained and part of them aren't. But in this case, Moog have actually taken quite a lot of care and consideration into helping people understand the various connections, including the manual, but also with the inclusion of these card overlays that show you different kinds of patches and help you understand what each element does. So in essence, or at least, with Mavis, it's much more straightforward than I've found other semi-modular synthesizers to be. And when you consider it as a package, then I think it's actually a really brilliant synth for beginners or people who want to understand a bit more about synthesis or have something self-contained to experiment with. Now we are talking about a synthesizer here, so it would be kind of foolish of me not to mention the sound of the thing, even though it is a Moog synth and I have already kind of demonstrated some of the sounds in practice. But I think it would be fair to say that some people might assume that because this is a more affordable Moog synthesizer and quite a compact package with those smaller knobs and all that kind of thing, that it might not sound particularly thick, it might sound a wee bit thin or whatever. And I have to say, in practice, that is not the case. I've owned a number of Moog synthesizers in the past, and it does have a big fat, characteristic sound that you would expect from a Moog. It's got their circuits in there, it's got the filter sound that you want and all that kind of thing, at least to my ears. And so this is a really nice entryway into the world of Moog synthesis at a kind of ridiculously affordable price. Ultimately, I think one of the strongest selling points of Mavis is its value for money. Now, I have seen that some people have suggested that 339 Great British pounds might be a tad expensive, but when you consider what you're actually getting and where you're getting it from, along with the sounds and the functionality and everything else, and by the way, the fact that if you bought equivalent modules within Eurorack, then you would probably almost certainly be spending a hell of a lot more, then I think 340 quid is actually a very fair price indeed. So that's my take on Mavis. If you're looking for a gift for somebody who's getting into the world of synthesis or modular systems for the first time, Mavis seems like a really good entry point, and I'm going to see what I can do with it over the next few weeks and months as I experiment a bit more. For now, goodbye.